Hello, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about the enthusiasm that many countries initially felt for the First World War and how that eventually gives way to unenthusiasm for the war and furthering that disgust for World War I. As we discussed previously, at the outset of the war, August 1914, September 1914, the war was fairly popular in most of the belligerent countries. You had huge amounts of people enlisting in Britain. You had people enlisting in Germany, even though Germany had a model for conscription. You had people enlisting in France. And many believed that the war would be a relatively quick affair. However, as 1914 drags on into 1915, it starts to become evident that this is not going to be the case. The casualties start piling up, reports start coming back from the front lines, and wounded soldiers start coming back to hospitals. This starts to really hurt the public's enthusiasm for the war effort and makes them a lot less willing to enlist to go fight in the conflict. Now, the British were in a somewhat different position than the French and the Germans were. Both the French and the Germans had a model for conscription in their countries. I'll use Germany's as an example. In Germany, by law, every male at the age of 20 was enlisted into the military to serve a term of 2 to 3 years. And after that time, they'd be placed in a reserve battalion, and there were numerous reserve battalions. And the older they got, the kind of further back they were placed in that reserve battalion. This meant that Germany had a very large population that was trained for warfare. And at the outset of the war, Germany had about 800 to 900,000 soldiers. Within 12 days, they were able to call in their reserves and turn that into 3.8 million soldiers. So Germany, at the outset of the war and going on into the war, didn't suffer these huge difficulties with enticing people to fight because the legality of it was you had to due to their conscription model. Now, Britain didn't have a model for conscription. Britain had a volunteer army. So what Britain had to do was to try to entice the British people to enlist. One of the ways that Britain attempts to do this is through guilt. Guilt is perhaps the British government's biggest weapon in promoting enlistment. You can see here on the screen right now 2 British propaganda posters that are evidence of this British attempt to use guilt in order to drive enlistment numbers. On the left, you have a British man who's being questioned by his kids what he did in World War I. The implication here is that the man doesn't want to have to answer nothing or I sat out the war. Rather, he would prefer to have some kind of heroic story so that he wouldn't be embarrassed in front of his children. So what this is essentially saying to the British public is you need to enlist so that you don't become embarrassed in front of your kids. The poster on the right is another attempt to try to promote this feeling of guilt within British men who hadn't enlisted. You can see there a smiling soldier, and the poster says, "He's happy and satisfied, are you?" And this is attempting to tell British men that they're probably feeling some kind of remorse for not enlisting, some dissatisfaction in their life for not enlisting. And so it says that if you want to feel fulfilled, you need to enlist in the British military. Of course, from what we know of the war, we know that the British soldiers are probably not happy and satisfied on the front lines, and this is an outright fabrication. Now, one of the more insidious tools that the British used in order to drive enlistment was a group known as the Order of the White Feather. The Order of the White Feather was a group of young women, single women, And the British government recruited very attractive women to do this. And essentially, what they would do is these women would go around the urban areas and they would look for men of fighting age who were not in uniform. What they would do is they would then confront these men, harass them, berate them, embarrass them, in an attempt to try to get them to enlist. After this verbal abuse had concluded, they would pin a white feather on the man's lapel, which was the international symbol of cowardice. So, this was another attempt to guilt men into joining the war effort. Now, I don't know about you all, but I know that back when I was in my late teens and early 20s, the opinion of attractive women was very influential on me. As someone who didn't get a whole lot of attention from women at the time, if a woman was essentially humiliating me for not participating in something, you would believe that there'd be a strong desire for me to start participating in that thing. So this was a very effective method of recruitment. Another way in which women were key to British recruitment was essentially trying to show British men that they needed to defend women, that the war was one to keep women safe. And so the poster on the left is an attempt to do that. You can see there that it is asking British men, um, are there any women in your life that you want to defend? Because if you don't, remember what happened to the women of Belgium. Now, we talked about the infamous rape of Belgium and the execution of Belgian civilians by the German soldiers. But it's important to keep in mind that the British fabricated a number of stories about what the Germans actually did in Belgium. Many of these stories were taken from the Germans' behavior during the Boxer Rebellion in the early 1900s in China. And although the Germans did behave that way in China, they did not in Belgium. And these were reports of killing babies, of raping women. And so the British are attempting to say, look, the Germans did this in Belgium. Again, they didn't. And you don't want them to be doing it here. Now, of course, the British were not the only ones to use the idea of women as a means for recruiting. Here you have two American propaganda posters. And again, the United States isn't going to get involved until 1917. But the interesting thing about this is that whereas the British mode of operation here was to try to get men to enlist to protect women as kind of like this defender of their women's chastity and virtue. The men in the United States are trying to be motivated to enlist to impress pretty women. And you can see by the designs on these posters that both of these women are drawn in a way to be vaguely sexual. And of course, supposed to be very attractive looking. And so the American point of view here is, oh, soldiers, if you enlist, you're going to get all of these pretty girls who are going to suddenly be very, very interested in you. Now, the Order of the White Feather and this attempt to make men enlist by guilt was not as successful as the British government had hoped for. And by the time we get to 1916, the British will eventually start conscription in their country as well. You can see here a poster that details the Military Service Act of 1916, and it applies to all unmarried men between the ages of 18 and 41, which is a pretty big range. What that means, seniors, is that both you and I would be subject to this piece of legislation. So you can see that Britain, their attempt to persuade people to enlist was not as effective as conscription was. Now, with that being said, there is still an attempt to get the people who are fighting um, to stay committed to the war effort. I mentioned before that much of the German reputation was derived from what the Germans had done during the Boxer Rebellion in China, right around the year 1900. And these two posters you can see are references to that. So the one on the left is supposed to be a depiction of Belgium. What you can see is the execution of Belgian civilians. You can see in the background there a depiction of violation of women by German soldiers. Again, whereas the execution of civilians was largely true, widespread raping of women in Belgium was not a substantiated claim. On the right, you can see German soldiers crucifying American soldiers by nailing them to a tree. Once again, this is a reference to what the Germans did in China during the Boxer Rebellion, and there is no evidence of this occurring during the First World War. But it is an attempt to show the war against Germany as a war against evil. That this is not simply a conflict about political differences or territorial differences. This is a war based on virtue and based on morality. One side is good, one side is evil. The evil side has to be stopped, which is somewhat unique in history. Now, the British also wanted to keep women at home motivated because women on the home front were essentially keeping the economy going. With Britain's economy focused on a total war style economy, the manufacture of weapons and munitions was essential to the war effort. You can look at battles like Verdun, where millions of shells are dropped in just the first couple of days. So this is an attempt to motivate the women of Britain to go to work in munitions factories to aid the war effort. And this is, like I said, a big example of this total war scenario where even civilians are still a part of the war effort and are still making contributions. This is also a big reason why women are going to wind up getting the right to vote in Britain following the First World War because of their economic contributions. Here we have some French propaganda, and I'll go ahead and move my face. That's probably a good spot down there. Now, the French propaganda that we have up here is an attempt to show unity, international unity between the countries that are participating. So you can see on the left there, it is allies in the war, united for peace. In the middle, you can see this idea of all for one and one for all, which of course, a quote taken from the Three Musketeers. And you can see Italy, France, Britain, United States, all banding together to defend France. And once again, you have this appeal to masculinity, this appeal to protecting women. And then on the right, an interesting thing you have is the French appealing to their colonial citizens, their citizens from Africa, to enlist in the war effort and to help out. And France depended very heavily on its colonial citizens, as did Britain, in order to bolster their numbers during the First World War. Here we have some German propaganda, and the German propaganda is very interesting. The German propaganda on the left there, you can see that Britain is being shown as rabid imperialists. You can see the British spider that is basically casting its web over the entire world. You can see that The British are ensnaring Turkey. The British are ensnaring Belgium. They're ensnaring the United States in the back, ensnaring India. And there's only one country that's strong enough to stop this attempt at world domination, and that is Germany, represented by the Black Eagle up on the cliff there. And so, once again, this is an appeal to morality, to the morality of the German people, saying, who else is there to stop British world domination if not the Germans? On the right, this poster essentially is telling the Germans, your fatherland is in danger. You should enlist, you should fight. And this is a very interesting tactic to take, especially considering the fact that the fighting was not taking place in Germany. Aside from very early battles on the Eastern Front, like Tannenberg, most of the fighting was taking place outside of Germany. And this poster is in deep contrast to what we're going to see at the end of the war, where most Germans can't fathom how they could have possibly lost because they felt as if they were on the offensive the whole war, that it was basically a German victory. But this poster is kind of saying the opposite, that early on in the war, Germany is facing a crisis. And here's some Russian propaganda, very interesting Russian propaganda. And in both of these images, you can see that Germany is portrayed as a petulant child, an unruly, tantrum throwing toddler. I would say it looks to be about 3 or 4 years old, aside from the very strange mustache in the left one. And in both of these, you can see that the toddler is doing something akin to misbehaving. On the left, you can see that the German toddler has broken that church toy, that representation of Notre Dame in France, through their cannon. And it's up to the Russians to come along and to punish that little German toddler. The picture on the right, you can see this German toddler is crying because the Russian boy has come along and stepped on his cannon, stepped on his artillery to put him in his place. And this is kind of interesting because it displays a lack of seriousness in the war. By showing this as simply a squabble between children, it doesn't showcase the severity that the war actually had, and the severity that is shown in the other pieces of propaganda that we've seen. But this is a very unique Russian take on the First World War. All right, everyone, I hope that was really helpful for you to understand how the enthusiasm at the start of World War I would eventually erode away and would be replaced by this large-scale dissatisfaction for the war, this lack of desire to fight, and hopefully you can also now understand the belligerent government's attempts to keep their people motivated, to keep them invested in the war, to keep them fighting, and to keep them believing. Because as we are going to see from here, nations are going to be on the verge of collapse as we get into 1917. And much of that collapse is going to take the form of discontent back home. We're going to see large-scale social unrest in nearly every nation that will be fighting in the war. When I talk to you next, we're going to be talking specifically about that dissatisfaction in Russia in 1917. So thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.